twisted tales, the shocking crimes of passion you won't forget. Hook. What happens when the darkness you thought you escaped comes back for you? Stay with me until the end to uncover the chilling truth that will leave you questioning everything. This hook should pique curiosity and keep your viewers engaged, encouraging them to watch till the end for the suspenseful revelation. The air in the room was thick with tension. It smelled faintly of smoke. The kind of smoke that lingered after something had burned. She stood motionless in the center of the room, eyes darting around. The floor creaked beneath her feet. The silence was almost unbearable. Her pulse hammered in her ears. A faint hum of electricity buzzed from somewhere. The lamp above flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. A clock ticked steadily, too loudly. Tick. 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 Each second felt like an eternity. The door had been locked. She was sure of it. Her hands shook as she reached for the doorknob. It turned easily. Too easily. Her breath caught in her throat. Had it always been unlocked? Her heart raced faster. A cold gust of wind swept through the room. It smelled like something rotten. Her body tensed. Her eyes went wide. Something was wrong. Something had changed. The hairs on her neck stood up. She could feel it. Someone was here. The faintest sound came from behind her. A shuffle. Barely audible, but there. She spun around. Nothing. The room was empty. But the air felt thick with a presence. Her heart pounded in her chest. She forced herself to move forward. Each step felt heavier. Her feet sank into the carpet. The room seemed to grow smaller, closer. The walls pressed in on her. The temperature dropped. Cold, like icy fingers on her skin. She wanted to run. But she couldn't. Something was holding her there. Her eyes searched every corner. But there was nothing. Then the mirror caught her eye. It wasn't quite right. The reflection wasn't hers. A figure loomed behind her. Tall. Silent. She gasped. The figure didn't move. It just stood there. Her breath hitched. The figure in the mirror smiled. She felt a chill race down her spine. A smile she knew too well. Too familiar. Her hands trembled as she reached for the mirror. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't stop herself. The smile in the reflection grew wider. Her own face stared back, but there was something wrong. Something twisted. The figure behind her was still there, unmoving. She backed away slowly. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Her body felt heavy. The floor creaked beneath her again. Was it her, or was something else moving? The figure in the mirror didn't move. But her reflection, it did. It stepped forward. Her eyes widened in horror. It shouldn't have been possible. Her reflection reached out, fingers pressing against the glass. And then, without warning, it tapped the surface. Once. Twice. The sound echoed in the room. Cold, sharp. Like a warning. She couldn't breathe. Her heart was racing now. Faster, harder. She was trapped. Her own reflection wasn't hers anymore. It was someone else. Someone she knew. A figure from her past. A face she thought she'd left behind. The figure in the mirror tilted its head. Slowly. Deliberately. A smile twisted on its lips. Her pulse quickened. The figure wasn't smiling anymore. Its expression was cold. Void of emotion. It raised its hand. And it tapped on the mirror again. But this time, there was something different. The tapping wasn't just on the glass. It was coming from inside her head. A soft, distant whisper. Barely audible, but unmistakable. Help me! The voice was familiar. A voice she hadn't heard in years. Her heart froze in her chest. Her eyes locked onto the figure's eyes. It was pleading. Pleading for something. Her breath came in quick, ragged bursts. Her mouth went dry. Her body was frozen. She couldn't look away. And then, the reflection moved. It wasn't just in the mirror anymore. It was in front of her. She stumbled back, her legs weak beneath her. The air felt thick, suffocating. The figure in front of her, it wasn't real. It couldn't be. But it was there. Closer now. Its eyes, dark, empty, locked onto hers. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Every muscle in her body screamed to run. But she couldn't. She couldn't move. The figure's lips parted. A low, raspy voice came through. "You left me." The words cut through her like a knife. Her stomach twisted. The voice was all too familiar. It was him. Her mind reeled. No, it couldn't be. It was impossible. But the figure stepped forward again. Closer. Closer. She could feel the cold from it. It reached for her. She gasped, stumbling backward. Her back hit the wall. Trapped. There was nowhere to go. The figure's face twisted in pain. Eyes narrowing. A low, guttural growl rumbled from its throat. "You thought you could forget?" It took another step. The room seemed to shrink. The shadows warped, curling like smoke. The temperature dropped again. Her breath came out in visible clouds. The figure's hand reached out. Its fingers were too long. Too sharp. "Help me!" The voice whispered again. The same voice. It had always been the same. A voice from her past. A voice from the darkness. Her mind flashed back too fast. The accident. The fire. The screaming. The body she left behind. Her stomach lurched. Her heart skipped a beat. The figure in front of her smiled again. A smile too wide. Too wrong. Her legs buckled beneath her. She sank to the floor, frozen in terror. The figure leaned in closer. Its breath was foul, rotting. "I never left," it whispered in her ear. A sound so haunting, she couldn't breathe. Her vision blurred. She could still hear the whisper. Still feel the coldness of its touch. And then... silence. The silence was deafening. Her body felt numb, like it wasn't hers. She struggled to breathe, but the air was thick, suffocating. The figure was still there. Just inches away. Its eyes boring into hers. It hadn't moved, but it was everywhere. Inside her head. Inside her chest. The whisper lingered in the corners of her mind. "I never left." Her body refused to obey. She wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her fingers twitched, but she couldn't move. The figure's presence filled every inch of the room. Her skin crawled. It was like a weight pressing down on her chest. Her vision swam, everything blurring in and out of focus. Then, slowly, a shadow stretched across the floor. Not from the figure. From behind her. Her heart thudded harder. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. But the shadow grew. Closer. Closer. The figure in front of her was still staring. It hadn't blinked. Hadn't moved. But it was all-consuming. The air around her grew colder. A distant sound, footsteps, reached her ears. Slow. Heavy. She wanted to turn, to see what was there. But fear rooted her in place. She could feel the weight of it closing in on her. The footsteps came nearer. Closer. Her breath caught in her throat. A figure emerged from the shadow. A silhouette tall, looming. It was a person. A man. But he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The air shifted again. The room felt smaller. The walls felt like they were closing in. The figure in front of her smiled. Wider, more twisted. The man behind her stepped forward. Closer. Closer still. His hand reached out. Not for her. For the figure. Her heart pounded in her chest. The figure's smile faded. It stepped back. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then a scream. A terrible, blood-curdling scream. Not from her. But from the figure. Her breath caught in her throat. The words hung in the air, thick with dread. She could barely breathe. The man's presence was overwhelming, suffocating. Her heart pounded in her chest, faster, louder. She tried to move, to scream, to run. But her body refused to obey. She was trapped. His cold gaze never left her. She could feel his breath on her skin. Each inhale, a jagged chill that made her shiver. His hand reached for her. Slowly. Deliberately. She closed her eyes, desperate to escape, to wake up. But when she opened them again, his hand was right there. Right in front of her. Fingers outstretched. She flinched, but couldn't pull away. The warmth of his touch was gone, replaced by an icy grip. Cold. Unyielding. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His eyes spoke volumes. The figure on the floor was still twitching, its movements growing more erratic. The shadows around them seemed to stretch. Darkness creeping, crawling, wrapping around them both. It felt like time was slowing. Every second dragged on. The man's grip tightened, pulling her closer. Her feet dragged against the floor. She wanted to scream. To fight. But her voice was trapped in her throat. Her limbs were heavy. Like she was underwater. The darkness pressed in harder, closing around her. And then, she heard it. A low whisper. Faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't the man. It wasn't the figure. It was behind her. Behind her, in the shadows. A voice. A voice she hadn't heard in so long. I'm not finished with you. The words froze her blood. She knew that voice. She knew it far too well. Her mind raced, but it couldn't make sense of anything. The grip on her arm tightened further. The voice behind her grew louder. Closer. Help me! It whispered again. The air became suffocating. The temperature dropped even more. Her vision began to blur. Her legs buckled beneath her, but the man didn't let go. He pulled her back up, steadying her with unnatural strength. The whisper was louder now. It was in her ears. In her mind. Help me! Her heart raced, panic flooding her chest. And then, in the reflection of the broken mirror, she saw it. A face. Her own face. But not her. It was distorted. Twisted. Eyes wide, hollow. It was coming for her. The reflection in the broken mirror shifted. It moved on its own. Her own face, twisted with pain, stretched toward her. Its hollow eyes fixed on hers. Cold. Empty. A twisted grin pulled at the edges of its mouth. The voice whispered again. I'm right here. She couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened. The reflection was reaching out. Not through the glass, but from behind her. The coldness against her neck made her shudder. A chill that felt like death itself. The man didn't speak. His grip was tight, suffocating. Her heart hammered in her ears. Faster. Louder. The darkness seemed to swallow the room. The shadows crawled up the walls. The air, thick with dread, clung to her skin. The voice continued. Closer now. I'm not done with you. The figure on the floor, still twitching, let out a soft moan. Its body shifted, its limbs jerking unnaturally. She tried to pull away, but the man's hand held her tight. You can't escape, he whispered in her ear. His breath was cold like ice. Her legs shook, her body trembling with fear. She wanted to run. To scream. But the room felt smaller, tighter. The walls pressing in. Her reflection in the mirror reached out again. Closer. Closer. She could feel its breath on her neck now. She could feel the icy fingers creeping toward her throat. The man stepped forward, blocking her view of the mirror. His eyes never left hers. You're part of this now, he said, his voice low, steady. The room was spinning. Everything felt unreal. The reflection, her reflection, was still there. Still moving. Still coming for her. Her mind screamed, but her body wouldn't obey. The shadows swirled, growing darker. The air was thick, suffocating. A sharp pain shot through her chest. She gasped. The reflection, her reflection, was smiling now. A smile that didn't belong. The figure behind her let out a low, guttural laugh. A sound so wrong, it made her stomach churn. You left me, the voice said again, but now it wasn't behind her. It was in her head. In her heart. She was drowning in it. Drowning in the darkness. The room seemed to close in around her. And then, silence. For a moment, everything stopped. The air hung heavy. The shadows, the whisper, the figure, they were all still there. But no movement. No sound. Only the unbearable stillness. Until a soft tap. Like a finger on glass. And then again. A tap. Closer. Each tap more urgent than the last. Her heart began to race again. And then the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening. For a moment, she could only hear her own breath. Short, panicked gasps. Her chest felt tight. The darkness still hung in the air, thick and heavy. Then, the tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't just from the mirror. It came from all around her. Faint. Rapid. A frantic series of taps. Closer. Closer. Her skin crawled as the sound filled the room. The man's grip tightened on her arm. His eyes never left hers. But there was something different in them now. A glint of amusement? She couldn't be sure. The taps were growing louder. Faster. The figure on the floor was still, but its form was changing. The twitching stopped. And then, suddenly, it rose. Slowly, like a puppet on strings. It moved toward her. Not quite walking, but dragging itself. Its limbs jerked unnaturally, pulling it forward with jerky, erratic movements. The tapping intensified. Her heart pounded louder in her ears. She tried to pull away, but the man's grip held her firm. She was frozen. The figure was almost upon her now. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers. A twisted smile stretched across its face. It was smiling, grinning like it had already won. And then, without warning, it lunged. Her breath caught in her throat. But the man's hand caught the figure midair. His grip was iron, unyielding. The figure screamed. A horrible, high-pitched wail. It clawed at his hand, but couldn't break free. The man stared down at it. His expression blank. "Not yet," he whispered, almost to himself. The figure shrieked again, its body convulsing in the man's hold. But then, he turned his attention back to her. And she felt it. A shift in the air. A presence darker than before. Something ancient. Something alive. The tapping continued, frantic now, like it was desperate to break through. She felt the weight of it pressing on her chest. The figure's eyes never left hers. The smile never faltered. She could hear the whisper again. Louder. Clearer. "You can't escape." And then the room shifted. The walls pulsed. The darkness swallowed her whole. Her vision blurred. And in the fleeting moment before everything went black, she heard a final whisper. A promise. "You're mine." The blackness swallowed her whole. Her body went numb. For a long moment, there was nothing. No sound, no light, no air. Just emptiness. But then, a flicker. A light. Faint, distant. She couldn't see it clearly. But she felt it. Warmth. Like the first breath after drowning. She gasped. Her body jerked upright. Her chest burned, but she was alive. She blinked, trying to focus. The darkness was gone. The room, still distorted, seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. Shadows clung to the corners, twisting like smoke. The man wasn't there. The figure was gone. Everything was still. But the silence. The silence was more oppressive than before. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Slowly she stood. Her legs wobbled beneath her. The room seemed to shift with every step she took. Each movement felt heavy, like wading through water. She looked around, but everything felt wrong. It wasn't the same room. Not the same place. The walls were different. The air smelled stale, suffocating. Her breath caught again. She wasn't alone. She could feel eyes on her. Heavy. Watching. Her body froze. Her gaze moved to the corner of the room. A shadow shifted there. Slow. Intentional. Something, someone, was lurking just out of sight. Her heart raced. And then, without warning, the shadow moved. A figure stepped out of the darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall. A woman. Her face was hidden, but her eyes were black. Empty. Hollow. She reached out, her fingers long and sharp. The air around her shimmered, crackling with energy. The woman's voice was a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "You thought you were free." The words made her blood run cold. The figure stepped closer. Closer still. Her every step echoed, louder than the last. The warmth she had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a bone-chilling coldness. The shadows around her seemed to grow, stretch. They pulled in tighter, suffocating. "Did you really think you could escape me?" The woman's voice was closer now. Her hand hovered just inches from her face. Her fingers reached forward, brushing her cheek. A cold so intense it burned. And then, the whisper came again. Faint but unmistakable. "You're mine now." And the darkness closed in once more. The darkness surged, swallowing her whole. Her vision blurred, then vanished entirely. She couldn't feel her body anymore. She couldn't hear her breath. Only the coldness remained. An endless void of cold. It was suffocating. Tighter. Tighter. She struggled, but the weight of it pressed in from every direction. Her lungs screamed for air, but none came. She tried to scream. Nothing. Her hands, her arms, were heavy, like they were sinking into the very fabric of the darkness. The whisper, soft yet sharp, echoed in her mind. "You belong to me now." The voice was everywhere. It was inside her. The cold pressed in deeper, crawling beneath her skin. She wanted to fight, wanted to tear herself free. But it was useless. The air, the very space around her, felt like it was turning to ice. She couldn't move. Couldn't think. Her mind, her body, were fading. And then, a light. Not warm, not inviting. But cold. White. Blinding. It pierced through the darkness, cutting through her like a blade. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath stolen by the force of it. The light was growing, expanding, pushing back the darkness. She didn't know how, didn't know why. But she felt a shift. A sudden pull. The whisper stopped. For a brief moment, there was silence. No cold. No whispers. No fear. Just emptiness. And then, in the distance, she saw it. A figure. Tall. Shrouded in the same white light. It was moving toward her. Slowly. Deliberately. She could barely make out the details, but something about it was familiar. It wasn't the woman. Not the man. It was something else. Something old. A presence that sent a chill down her spine. The figure stepped closer. 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 It moved in a way that was unnatural, as though it didn't belong in this world. Her heart raced once more. She wanted to move. To flee. But she was trapped. Frozen in place. The figure reached out. Its hand, like the rest of it, was glowing with an unnatural light. And then, it spoke. But it wasn't in words. It was a feeling. A rush of cold, a shiver down her spine. She felt the weight of its touch before it even made contact. A pressure on her chest, cold and unbearable. It was the weight of her past. The weight of everything she had tried to forget. The figure's eyes were hidden behind a veil of light, but she felt them. Felt them like a fire burning into her soul. And then, the whisper came again. Faint, but clear. "You can't escape." The light surrounding the figure began to twist, bending in unnatural shapes. It flickered like a dying flame, then brightened again. Her heart pounded in her chest, the rhythm erratic, frantic. She couldn't look away, even though every part of her screamed to run. The figure's presence felt suffocating, like it was pulling the air from her lungs. Each step it took toward her sent a pulse of cold through her body. Closer. Closer. The air turned frigid, stinging her skin with an ice she couldn't escape. She tried to speak, to scream, but no words came out. It was like her voice had been stolen, her body frozen in time. The figure's hand was outstretched now, a mere inch from her face. She could feel the weight of it, like an invisible force pressing against her. A quiet hum filled the space, vibrating in her chest, deep and ancient. Her thoughts became a blur. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, trembling. The figure didn't respond, but its movements were deliberate. It reached toward her forehead. For a moment, everything felt still. Then, like an explosion, memories rushed back. Fragments of faces, moments of pain, confusion, flashes of a past she had long buried. The fire. The crash. The screams. Her hands, trembling, pressed against her forehead as if trying to hold them back, but it was too late. The memories were overwhelming, impossible to shut out. "You can't escape." The whisper came again, this time stronger. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she fell to her knees. The cold, the weight of it, it was crushing her. But then, suddenly, everything stopped. The light. The shadows. The cold. The figure was gone. For a split second, she was alone in the quiet. The pressure in her chest, the suffocating weight, disappeared. She gasped for air, her vision swimming. Was it over? But as she looked around, her body frozen in place, something wasn't right. The room had changed again. It was darker now. Faded. And in the corner there it was. A reflection. Her own face smiling back at her. But this time, it wasn't just a reflection. It was her. But not her. And then the whisper came again, softer this time, almost a laugh. "You never left." The room was still. Silent. The darkness felt endless, but not in the way it had before. It wasn't pressing on her, suffocating her. It was waiting. Her breath steadied, slow and cautious. She glanced around, her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. And then, her eyes fell upon the mirror. The reflection was clearer now, the edges sharp, defined. Her face stared back at her. But this time, there was no twisted smile. No hollow eyes. No shadowy figure lurking behind her. It was just her. A moment of peace. She exhaled, relief flooding her chest. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it was over. The stillness of the room, the absence of the oppressive weight, gave her a sense of calm. A sense of release. She stepped toward the mirror, cautiously, afraid to disturb the fragile peace. Her reflection was unchanged. Just her. She reached out a trembling hand, the cool surface of the glass meeting her fingers. It felt solid. Real. She held her breath, the silence stretching out around her. But then, a soft shift. Not in the mirror. Not in the room. But in her mind. A voice. Faint. Familiar. "Did you really think you could escape?" The words were not an accusation. They weren't angry, nor threatening. They were sad. Resigned. She froze, her fingers still pressed against the glass. And then she understood. The reflection, her reflection, was not just a mirror of her. It was a part of her. A part that never truly left. A shadow of the past, the memories, the darkness. It was a part of the truth she had run from, buried deep. But the darkness was always there, waiting. And she couldn't outrun it forever. A final whisper, soft but clear, filled the space. "Now you know." The room grew quieter, the light dimming. And in the reflection, her face softened. Not with fear, but with acceptance. And the mirror grew still. No more whispers. No more shadows. Just her. The room, the darkness, everything, faded into silence. And with it, the story ended.